Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founding and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. This is the virtual reading group. We're continuing to read this wonderfully interesting and esoteric, maybe flaneur-like book, Men in Dark Times by Hannah Arendt. Last week, we read what I said was probably the most difficult essay in the book. Difficult for a number of reasons. It was the essay on Hermann Broch, partly because it was quite academic. It was written for an academic audience. And secondly, it was an act of friendship and loyalty. And Arendt wrote it, even though she loved Broch's literature, didn't particularly care for his philosophy, and yet wrote it out of a deep loyalty to Broch as one of her closest friends. The essay we're reading today is also an act of friendship. Walter Benjamin was one of Hannah Arendt's closest friends in the period when they were both in France, in Paris, between 1933 and 1940. They met through Gershom Scholem, a friend who had studied with Benjamin in Bern in Switzerland, and was friends with Arendt as well. The difference is that whereas for someone like Broch, Hermann Broch, Arendt really wrote out a loyalty but didn't love his philosophy. The danger with the essay on Benjamin is almost the opposite, which is that Arendt in some ways feels so close to Benjamin that it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. And one wonders sometimes whether one is reading about Arendt or Benjamin. We're not scholars per se in this group. And so the exact boundaries of whether Arendt is right or wrong about Benjamin is not per se our interest, although you certainly can bring it up if you want. One of the big controversies in this world here is Arendt is in a sense arguing against an unnamed interlocutor here, Theodor Adorno. Adorno was also one of Benjamin's closest friends, and apparently, and it was his chosen literary executor. Arendt thought Adorno's dialectics and Marxism was foreign to Benjamin, and that Adorno censored and edited Benjamin's text in ways that were not true to him. And she fought really very hard, a lifelong battle in her mind to protect her Benjamin from Adorno's. And this essay is in some sense an act of friendship in which she's trying to protect and preserve the Benjamin she loves and knows from the Benjamin that has been brought into the world through Adorno's act of literary executorship and publishing, which she thinks has changed and de-emphasized and wrongly emphasized parts of Benjamin's work. This essay, thankfully, unlike the Broch essay, which was published in an academic Festschrift, this was published in the New Yorker. One wonders if an essay like this could even be published in any journal for a public forum today, let alone the New Yorker. It's challenging. I don't want to minimize that. It's written in a strange order. It starts with this immediate question about fame and posthumous fame. And as one of you wrote in the Slack chat a few days ago, we're talking about posthumous fame and Benjamin's fame, and she hasn't even told us who he is. I mean, usually in a biography, you start with who he is. To the extent that comes in the essay, it comes much later and in drips and drabs. And so you know, that's one of the challenges of this. So why does she open with this question of posthumous fame? What she's really after in part one of this, which she calls the hunchback, is that Benjamin was sui generis, which is he's born of his own. He's not classified. She says a number of things which I can pull out in this list. He was erudite, but he was not a scholar. He was a textualist, but not a philologist. He wasn't religious and he wasn't a theologian, but for him the text was sacred. He was a born writer, but his preferred mean of writing was citing other writers. He translated Proust among others, but he wasn't a translator. He was a reviewer, but not a critic. He wrote histories, but he wasn't a historian. He thought poetically, but was not a poet or a philosopher. Now, anyone who knows Arendt, and those of you who've been with us for a little while, knows that almost every one of these could be said about Hannah Arendt, right? She thinks philosophy, she does philosophy, but she's not a philosopher. You know, is I may be the main one. She does history, but is not a historian. She was certainly erudite beyond belief, but I don't think really was a scholar, maybe a bit more so than Benjamin. But all of these are related. And so that's what she's really after in this cold open with this question of posthumous fame. She then invokes this idea of the flaneur, which is going to come back through the essay and is going to play a very important role. The flaneur is a term for someone, she says, originally defined by Baudelaire, who's aimlessly strolling through crowds. There's a sense of the flaneur as someone who has money and thus doesn't have to work. And this idea of the flaneur here is brought in part one here, in a sense, in this effort that I mentioned earlier to contest the idea that Benjamin was a Marxist. You know, the Adorno reading of Benjamin is that he was dialectical, and that he had a kind of theory of history. And Arendt says, look, he was not. If anything, he was the opposite. He was a flaneur. He had no systematic interest whatsoever. He was interested in phenomena, factual existences. And so contra Adorno, who thought Benjamin was a philosopher, she says that he always begins with a concrete thing to be discovered in the world of appearances, in which significance and appearance, word and thing, idea and experience would coincide. And the great image here, for those of you who know it, and I'll share it just so those of you who want can see it, is the Paul Klee painting Angelus Novus, the Angel of History. And this is a painting that Benjamin actually purchased from Paul Klee in 1921. And in Benjamin's imagination, this angel of history is being blown backwards, facing history, being blown back from a wind into the future. His face turned to the past, looking over the rubble and the debris of history. And this being blown back, idea that history moves while you're looking back and you're blown from some phenomena into the future, is as far from Marxist dialectics, Arendt says, as you can get, right? The idea of dialectics is that you have a thesis, antithesis, conclusion, then another thesis, antithesis, conclusion, synthesis, and that it sort of works in sort of a logical, historical motion. is far from what Benjamin is about as you can get. And so then the part one on the hunchback ends with this idea of the hunchback. You know, her argument here, and this is again part of her sympathy for Benjamin as a friend, he was beset by bad luck. You know, she quotes this poem about the hunchback, the Buchlein. You know, the number of bad luck things in Benjamin's life pile up. He wrote a habilitation on the origin of German tragedy, and even though it was brilliant, it was failed in Frankfurt, and that spoiled any chance of a career in the university for him. His one big break was essay on Goethe's elective affinities, alienated him from a very powerful school, the Stefan George School. And then, of course, probably most importantly, his suicide. And Arendt introduces it on page 170 and writes, on September 26th, 1940, Walter Benjamin, who was about to emigrate to America, took his life at the Franco-Spanish border. And, you know, Arendt and Benjamin had been together in France. She had something he didn't have, like, right, common sense. And she was able to work it out, and she helped him a lot. And she kept trying to get others to help him. But in the end, the reason he didn't get out was simply bad luck. He got to the border, and that day they had shut the border. And, you know, as she says at the end of that section, one day earlier, Benjamin would have gotten through without any trouble. One day later, the people in Marseille would have known that for the time being, it was impossible to pass through Spain. Only on that particular day was the catastrophe possible. Only on that day, right, September 26, 1940, did you get to the border and you couldn't get through. And Benjamin could have gone back, but he had heart problems, he was exhausted, and he committed suicide. And that's his bad luck, his hunchback. Part two of the essay she calls Dark Times. And here it sort of really starts to get into the theory or the meat of the essay. She's going to compare Benjamin with Kafka and Krauss, Franz Kafka and Karl Kraus, three brilliant Jewish writers who are writing in Central Europe around the same time. There are three Jews struggling with what she calls the break in tradition, the loss of history and authority. And she brings in a very important essay for that era by a man named Moritz Goldstein, an essay called Deutsch-Jüdische Parnass, German-Jewish Parnassus, which was published in 1912. For those of you who haven't read the essay, it's really worth spending some time with. Shayla Ben Habib, in her new book on exiles, has a chapter on this essay and on Arendt, and brings them together in important ways. There's a podcast I do with Shayla Ben Habib on our podcast page where we talk a bit about this if you're more interested in it. But the basic idea of Goldstein's essay is that Jewish intellectuals of this period, Jewish middle-class Jews of this period wished to remain Jews, right? They wanted to hold on to their being Jewish, and yet they also wanted to assimilate, and thus to do that, they couldn't acknowledge and thus didn't want to acknowledge their Jewishness. And they were caught in this double bind. It's this double bind which largely led middle-class Jewish thinking in Central Europe to deny anti-Semitism and to assimilate. And Arendt is very critical of this, as is Goldstein, and she calls it a loss of reality. You were unable to, you were caught between these two things, and you couldn't address the reality. You had to pick one or the other. the intellectuals, the people she's writing about, like Benjamin, in a sense, recognize this, and what they're writing about and where they're writing from, she says, this is what she calls dark times, is the shattering of the Jewish tradition, that led these geniuses, these Jewish geniuses, to see not only that the Jewish tradition was no longer accessible to them, they couldn't both be Jewish and German, but it's bigger than that. You couldn't be Western and modern. This is the birth of a kind of modernist critique. You couldn't continue to live in the tradition of, you know, the Western world, German or French or English, or just Western or whatever it was, and still also be a modern middle class, successful bourgeoisie. And so these writers who saw that, she says, write to expose the shattering of not just the Jewish tradition, but all tradition, to expose that we live amidst the rubble, that we live in decline. And worst of all, not only do they write to push through this deeply pessimistic vision of decline and shatter and rubble, but what they insist is there's no way to build something new. There's no way to create a new beginning, right? This is in a way where Arendt is going to differ from these friends of hers. I mean, so much of her work is about the possibility of revolution, of new foundations, of bringing a new thing to the world, with this idea of natality, of spontaneity, and creating newness. She's, you know, she knows how hard it is, but she holds on to this idea that it is human to create newness. But for Benjamin and Kafka and Krauss and others, there's no, they write not as precursors of a new, but simply almost as prophets of the death of tradition. She cites a poem by Bertolt Brecht in the footnotes on page 191, in which he says, "We know we are only temporary," right? There's no hope of creating something solid. She cites a parable of Kafka's, I mean, brilliant parable, in which Kafka writes about everything he does appears to him extraordinarily new, but also because of the impossible abundance of the new, extraordinarily amateurish. Wow, the amateurish. It's new, but it can't start something new. It's not going to ever begin a new tradition. There's no new foundations. And she talks about a number of ways now that Benjamin embraces this and embodies this idea. One is this idea of Benjamin the collector, one who collects books and tears them out of context and puts them on a shelf, doesn't even read them. He has all these books on child psychology. He doesn't have any interest in it, but he collects them. He's a flaneur. He idles around, strolls, and doesn't engage in the world. He loves Paris, the place of arcades. He writes a wonderful book, Passage, an arcade project. About just wandering. And then eventually the homme de lettres, this man of letters. And what unites all of these for her is a kind of world foreignness, a world Weltfremdheit, foreignness to the world, or a strangeness to the world. There's no career goal. There's no engagement in the world. They're homeless in a way. They're stateless, and they embrace it. And so what holds this chapter together in some way is this distinction she makes near the end of the chapter between the man of letters, the homme de lettres, and the intellectual. And we all know she's not very happy with intellectuals. She says intellectuals are sort of part of society. They're the bureaucrats. They sell themselves to whoever's in charge and help them administer society. And she says they're most fit for despotic societies. Now, again, by intellectual, she doesn't mean Benjamin and people like him, but a certain kind of expert. Against the intellectuals, she holds up this idea of the homme de lettres, these other kinds of intellectuals who seek seclusion, rebellion against society. Instead of seeking power and seeking to enter into government and become experts, they have contempt for society. And in her book On Revolution, she has a much longer section on the homme de lettres, and she makes an argument that they were very important in the revolutions of the 18th century, the French and American revolutions, because in their contempt for society, they were largely well-off people, sons mostly of well-off people, who hated society, hated the aristocratic society, and felt powerless, and felt obscure. And so they wrote, and they started to recover an old idea of freedom that they took from the classic ages. And it was that classic idea of freedom that they began to celebrate, Montaigne, Montesquieu, Pascal, and others, that became, for Arendt, the intellectual foundation of the French and American revolutions and their idea of freedom as a public idea, public freedom or public happiness. But in this essay, she sees the homme de lettres actually as dangerous. Well, she says it seems rather whimsical and harmless, but it is not. And the danger of the homme de lettres and the flaneur and the collector, what she calls the not so harmless peculiarities on page 198, is that they were part of a gesture that was so significant of an era of public darkness, with which the collector not only withdraws from the public into the privacy of his four walls, but takes along with him all kinds of treasures that once were public property. So these flaneur, collector, the homme de lettres, they pull back. They pull back, and they allow the public realm to be darkened by bureaucrats and intellectuals of the other kind. In a sense, they paved the way for totalitarianism in her writing. And that's obviously not their fault. They're not totalitarians at all. That's not, they're the opposite of totalitarians. But she's saying that's what happened. The last section, the most famous section, and by far the most rich section of this essay on Benjamin, is the third one, titled "The Pearl Diver," which begins with the Shakespeare citation from The Tempest. I don't want to read it. I'm not gifted enough to read Shakespeare out loud in public. But the idea of the quote is that there are these that a father lies, right, under the sea, and of his bones coral are made, and of his eyes pearls are made. And the collector is the one who pulls not the whole reef up, or doesn't recreate the father, but pulls the beautiful coral or the beautiful pearls up and puts them in their house. This image of the pearl diver who dives for the pearl and picks up the beautiful, unique thing from the past and loves it and puts it on their shelf, the pearl diver, is the image for what Arendt calls the break in tradition. She says the past is transmitted by tradition, so it has a certain authority. And authority presents itself historically. And in presenting itself historically, it becomes a tradition. What the break in tradition does is that it makes the loss of authority and the loss of tradition irreparable. And for Benjamin, his response to this is pearl diving down into the ocean and pulling up pearls. But in his case, pearls are citations from any author or work or even painter, and collecting them and creating a new work out of the beauty of the past. And there's a preservative element of that, right? Arendt says you preserve the past by pulling out the best parts of it, the beautiful parts of it. But what there also is a destructive element of that, insofar as that when you pull out the past pearls and you pull out the strange and the exotic, you destroy the context, you destroy the whole. You get caught up in the interesting, but not in the whole, the oneness. And she says on page 195, that you bring up little pearls of wisdom, pearls of truth, but the consistence of truth has been lost. On 196, she says, tradition transforms truth into wisdom, and wisdom is the consistence of transmissible truth. Tradition transforms truth into wisdom, and wisdom is the consistence of transmissible truth. But absent tradition, with just excerpts, citations, you have neither wisdom nor tradition nor truth in the sense of truth that she's talking about. In the Shakespeare metaphor, we preserve pearls and coral. When we talk about politics today, she says, we hear the Greek polis, from which it comes. And maybe we do, and maybe we don't know that polis comes from the Greek verb pelein, which is the smoke rings that go up around a smoke pipe. And maybe we do, and maybe we don't know that pelein, as politics, is the idea that politics is the act of a politician who stands in the center of a group of people who are multiple and plural and diverse, and in some way speaks the common truth that makes them a people. And she says, as long as we speak of politics, whether we know it or not, in some way, we still have our tradition. And yet, if politics becomes just about power, just about rhetoric and propaganda, and even if we pull out a nice quote from Winston Churchill or a nice quote from Plato, we've lost the context. So, those who cite, Churchill or Plato or great political quotes, she says, are like pearl divers who descend to the bottom of the sea, not to excavate the bottom and bring it to light, not to bring the whole context of politics up, not to recreate our tradition, but to pry loose the rich and strange, the pearls and the coral. It's on page 205. And so for her, when you think this way, you are thinking what she calls poetically. And she says of Benjamin, and this is really the thesis of her essay, is that he's a poetic thinker, the gift of thinking poetically. Poetically also means for her metaphorically. You're not interested in binding logical statements. He's not interested in theories or ideas or those kind of ideas. He's interested in those sort of quick flashes of insight. Like in Homer, Hector's eyes flashed like fire, or the army approaches in line after line is like the sea's long billows that roll to shore in line after line and burst on the land like thunder. It's that kind of thinking that gives material form to invisible ideas that Arendt is interested in. And here again is where I turn us again to the danger of Arendt's method, which is whether to the extent that she brings Benjamin to her. For Arendt herself, she writes in her Denktagebuch, all thinking is metaphorical. She writes also that metaphor is what links thought and writing. What is called a metaphor in fiction is in philosophy called a concept. Thought creates its concepts from the visible to designate the invisible. And this is one of her real insights that travels through much of her writing, that all thinking in concepts is founded in metaphor, and that there's an insightful, metaphoric, poetic origin to all thinking. And here she's bringing her project and Benjamin's project together. Again, I'm not saying it's unjustified at all. I think it's quite justified. I'm just saying it's a controversial element of the work that has been criticized. So I'm going to stop there as an introduction and see if there's people who want to respond immediately. And we also have, I think, a bunch of questions and comments in the chat, which I'll go to. Let me first ask if Samantha, if you want to say anything immediately, or do you want to wait?
Hi, yeah, let me just, a couple of people have sent me private questions. So let me just address those because I think they help with the general context. So just first to say, Hannah Arendt actually met Walter Benjamin in Berlin. He was a cousin of her first husband, Gunther Anders. And then he was also good friends with her second husband, Heinrich Blücher. And so she met him through those men in her life, and they became very close, as Roger said. It was really her relationship with Walter Benjamin that constellated her relationship with Scholem, which I think is important, and we hear echoes of Scholem in this essay. This essay wasn't originally written for the New Yorker. It was actually written in German because she couldn't write it in English because she was too close to Walter Benjamin. She wrote it to be the introduction to Illuminations, which was the first English translation and publication of Walter Benjamin's work for an English-speaking audience. And she had her essay and the Benjamin essays in the volume translated by Harry Zone. And she had a very heavy hand in the translations, but I think it does speak to her closeness that she couldn't write about him in English when she tried. She had to go back to their shared mother tongue of German. And then it was published in the New Yorker alongside the volume of Illuminations when it was published. So I think that takes care of the questions. Just one note about the flaneur as a figure. The flaneur is really central to Walter Benjamin's Passengenweg, to the Arcades project, and to his reading on Baudelaire, which got him into a bit of trouble and controversy with Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer and his stipend that he was receiving in exile from the Institute for Social Research. He takes the idea of the flaneur out of Baudelaire, particularly Baudelaire's poem, The Crowds, where the poet is the one who wanders through the crowd, looking through the eyes of the others, as a kind of imaginative exercise. And in this way, the flaneur is the one who actually stands apart from the modern mass man, is able to resist the leveling of mass society. And the figure of the flaneur really becomes the figure in a certain way of this poetic thinker, but has a lot to do with imagination as well, and what it means to inhabit the viewpoint of another. And that's part of how Arendt's thinking about this concept of, I think, poetic thinking and developing it through her essay on Benjamin. If you're interested in the publication of Illuminations, I wrote an article on it for the LA Review of Books, the history of it, which gets into some of the details of that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Samantha. For those who are new and don't know, Samantha is the assistant director of the center, so welcome. Are there questions immediately about the presentation, or I can also go to the chat where I see there's a lot of really good questions as well. So, but if anyone has something burning they want to interject, please do. You just have to unmute yourself. I can start with the first question from Connell. Connell, do you want to ask it, or do you want me to read it? Connell asks about the question "Dark Times," which is as I said, the heading of part 2 on page 171 of the essay, and he asks whether it's related. You know, the book is called "Men in Dark Times." And he asks whether it's related to how she describes dark times on page Roman numeral 7 through 9 in the preface. And yes, I mean, I think it's quite related. The premise of the book of Dark Times is that our public world has been darkened. you know, she has that, she has the quote from Heidegger that she uses, das Licht der Öffentlichkeit verdunkelt alles, the light of the public obscures everything. And what she means there is that in this world of double talk and people on, you know, people on TV and all the what are they called, prognosticators and publicists and all those people, there's a lot of mere talk, and people talk about everything, but the world is not enlightened by it. And the book, she says, is dedicated to those people whose life, in some way, their life and work shed light on the world, right? And all the people in this book here, Benjamin, are people who she thinks of as lights in dark times. In this section 2 of the Benjamin essay, as I was trying to say, Benjamin, along with Kafka and Krauss, are responding to one element of dark times, right? And this is the darkness of a loss of reality. So one way that reality can be lost is through idleness, idle talk and double talk and pundits and everyone just screaming and yelling, but no one actually saying anything. She says that what they saw was a complete mendacity, a lying by middle-class Jews and even non-Jews about the fact that they still thought they could live amidst the tradition and into a modern world that no longer fit together. They didn't want to admit the break of tradition. And so in this case, the dark times is not necessarily the fact of the break of tradition, right? That's the danger of monstrosity. The dark times is the lying mendacity, the covering up of that break. And to a certain extent, people like Benjamin and Kafka are trying to shed light on that break and thus the darkness of the times. You know, and Samantha is absolutely right when she says that the flaneur is sort of this rebellious character. And yet, Arendt is also saying that in some way, insofar as the flaneur and the collector retreat from the public, there's a way in which they also are dangerous and contribute to the dark times.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Zainab, is Zainab trying to talk?
Yes.
Zainab?
No, I just
Yeah.
have, that's so interesting. When I read Heidegger Code, I was like surprised by the fact that, and then I understood that it, like what she meant when I thought about concealment. I thought about this idea of concealment and the public realm. It's where spontaneity and actualization happens. And when we cannot really actualize ourselves and be spontaneous in that public realm, then we're just concealing. And at the end of, I don't know which part, but she cites Heidegger concealment in German, this idea of concealment. So Heidegger talks also about this idea of concealment, but she briefly talks about this at the end. And I thought that would be interesting to see where did he use that word, like in which, I never read Heidegger, and now I would like to read him, and I would like to know where did he talk about the public realm and this idea of concealment and all that.
Yeah. Well, so this idea of I mean, the public realm and concealment is not per se Heidegger's topic. To the extent he talks about it, it's in the chapter on idle talk in Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, which I think is chapter 17 or 18. If my memory correct, it's been a while. But the idea of concealment is at the very center of almost everything Heidegger ever wrote. You know, one of his, if not his central, one of his central ideas is the withdrawal of being. For him, that what the Greeks understood was that truth was wrested from concealment. And so the Greek word for truth was aletheia. A is a privative, thea lethe is hiddenness. And so truth is that which is taken out of concealment. Interestingly enough, in the life of the mind, when Arendt writes about the importance of metaphor, one of the main examples she uses is that in order to understand thinking, from Plato on, thinking was thought through sight, right? It's the eye of the mind. And as a result, it had a certain kind of concreteness to it that not for all thinkers, but for many led to a kind of privileging of logic, of concordance, that what I think blue, I have to see blue. And what Heidegger did is he's really one of the first thinkers to switch the metaphor for thinking from sight to hearing. And that's what Arendt is talking about here in the essay on Benjamin in page 201, when she says that Heidegger was extraordinary early success in the 20s was due to a, quote, listening to the tradition, a hearing that does not give itself up to the past, but thinks of the present. And that without realizing it, Benjamin actually had more in common with Heidegger's remarkable sense for living eyes and living bones that had sea changed into pearls and coral, and as such could be saved and lifted into the present only by doing violence to their context in interpreting them with the deadly impact of new thoughts than he did with Marxists and dialectics. I mean, Heidegger, in his essay on, I think it's the work of art, talks about how when you take a work of art and put it in a museum, you kill it, right? On the one hand, you preserve it. You know, we can all go see Van Gogh's shoes or Picasso in the museum. But when you do it, you take it out of the world in which it was made and the world it was bought. You know, the biggest example is you go to the Met and you see the temple, right? It's nice, but it's not the Egyptian world. And so this idea of tearing something out, and so the silence is hearing. The silence that one hears is an attempt to hear what is unsaid, that ultimate truth. Jack, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I wanted. This is now seems a digression because I was returning to Connell's comment, but it seems to me since we've been studying Hannah Arendt, I've come to think that a lot of her work is a re-examination of her own work. That a good deal of the time she's thinking again about something that she's already thought through in some way, and reshaping it to fit some other circumstance or some other idea that she wants to include or eliminate. And so in the question about Dark Times, the way I felt when Connell asked that question was, okay, here is this title, The Dark Times, which she describes particularly for Benjamin, and in this particular period, a specific time that she is talking about, the time during which he lived and died. And at the beginning of this book, she's talking about Dark Times over a much broader period of history, and she's thinking of it in a much, I would say, deeper way, as though she were inspired by her own writing to think deeper about Dark Times. So I think my comment was that yes, it's the same, but on the other hand, it's different because although the conditions that prompt the ideas are the same, the idea is very much expanded in the preface.
Yeah, although I mean, Sam, you may have a better idea than I do. I assume the preface was written after the Benjamin essay. Yeah, I mean, the preface was written in January '68. The Benjamin essay was published in '68.
Yeah.
in Illuminations, and the New Yorkers are around the same time. So, I mean, I think she's probably in some way, I mean, you know, she wrote all these essays separately. This was one of the later ones. I think she's in some sense taking the idea of dark times and thinking it through around the same time, both within regard to Benjamin and within regard to the whole book and this collection of essays. Does that sound right, Sam, to you and your thoughts?
Yeah, so it sounds right. I would say the preface and the writing of the introduction to the volume Illuminations overlapped, and she also gave a lecture in German on Benjamin in 66 and 67 and 68, which is you can find a video of it in German, which is different from the introduction that we have here. So there's two texts on Benjamin that are produced at this time. But the term Men in Dark Times, I think it's just important to note, comes from Bertolt Brecht's poem An die Nachgeborenen, or To Those Who Come After, which is where she takes the phrase in dark times from. Wirklich, wir leben in dunklen Zeiten. Really, we live in the dark times is how it begins. And Arendt and Benjamin and Brecht, with others, spent a lot of time together in exile in Paris in the 1930s. And when Benjamin went to go visit Brecht, he would bring back some of his poems, which had been unpublished, to Paris and share them with the emigre community. And so, you know, there's also that overlap that I think comes through that Jack is picking up on. And just to add, since we were talking about Heidegger, there's a great quote in Arendt's essay on Heidegger at 80, where she says, you know, if we're lucky enough, we'll all live to rethink everything we've thought before, right? So yes, Jack, this is essential to Arendt's conception of thinking. She's always thinking, rethinking, because for her, there's no end to the process and thinking itself. And that's part of her understanding of what it means to be a thinking, living, breathing being. And so I think you're absolutely right to pick up on that.
Sam,
Yeah,
could you repeat that source? Could you repeat that source, Sam?
Heidegger at 80. You can find it in Thinking Without a Banister.
Okay, thanks.
Can I speak?
I'm just gonna jump in on that and say one thing, which is when I founded the Arendt Center now 14 years ago, the first course I taught with my students at Bard College was a course on the origins of totalitarianism. And as I went through it, I was just shocked repeatedly at how many of the ideas in it were ideas that I had known from so many of her other books and essays throughout. And when a couple of years ago, when we read the Rahel Varnhagen book in this group, again, written way, way back in the 30s, 20s, 30s, again, the ideas of were there. You know, she comes back to them over and over again. But she doesn't write the same thing at all. She's deepening in it. She's playing with it. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Jack and Sam. There's a enormous. I mean, she's not a systematic thinker. She doesn't always use the same words. I don't think she's a consistent thinker in the sense that if she uses a word here one year and uses the same word, you can expect it to be the same. She's not. That's not how she writes. But the center is there throughout. Okay, I'm sorry. Who did I interrupt? I can't see everybody. There's like, you know,
Sorry, it was me. It was Dave.
Hi, Dave. Hi, nice to see you.
A few things I'd like to say. First of all, again, to thank you. I think there's something of the kind of experience that Arendt has talked about in relation to Benjamin that one has in reading this book. Because this book, in a way, doesn't have any theme that holds it together. And yet you feel that you're having an amazing stroll through a way of thinking. So you both see it's the same person thinking, and yet it has a kind of strolling quality. I mean, I was thinking of I think Arendt quotes somewhere Socrates saying that thought is something that happens in the wind. And there seems to be a kind of, what she seems to be constantly going back to is the forms of constraint that damage thinking through dogma, through tradition, through cliche, and so on. And I think there's something about revisiting things in the way that we're talking about, is trying to maintain what's alive. A bit like the beautiful analogy she gives of the difference between the critic and the commentary. Because the critic, the commentator, is someone who looks at the ashes of the fire that's burnt, whereas the critic is more like the alchemist who seeks to understand the nature of the flame. So again, that's something for maintaining life. And there's a thinker, an analytic thinker called Wilfred Bion, who was also very interested in philosophy, but he talked a lot about what he called the distinction between the container and the contained. So if you like, the container could be the mind, and what is contained is the thought. And the issue of development is that the container can allow the thought to develop without crushing it into dogma or into empty tradition, but also without itself being destroyed so that it becomes chaos. So there's a kind of dialectical tension there, which I think she's seeing in her own work. That's why she's unclassifiable. And also she's seeing in Benjamin. I think she's, and I think you alluded to this at your beginning, she's unfair to Adorno, because Adorno is also struggles so much with how to express himself freely. And he picks up things like, he becomes interested in horoscopes, slogans, adverts, seeing that condensed within these, in the dross, what he calls the dross, is so much condensed that we need to understand. So he's all the time sort of pulling away. And I'll just read you something that he said. This is Adorno. As the reflections of truth, appearances are dialectical. For to reject all appearance is to fall completely under its sway, since truth is abandoned with a rubble without which it cannot appear. And then second quote, where he's talking about how you have to investigate the dregs.
Yeah.
He says, to take the most famous instance in modern times, the attention paid by Freudian psychology to the dross and the dregs, the meaningless, the apparently of worthless of the phenomenal world. If you have a theory like Freud's, you were able to see that these worthless things have so much to teach us about the world as it is. So not to be drawn into the things that are shouting. And that seems to be also much in line with both with Adorno and with Benjamin.
That's helpful, Dave. That's helpful. I mean, just to give you the quote, it's one of those famous quotes of Arendt. There's so many of them. And just like in a way, Benjamin is about citation. One of the things I think you can say that Arendt is quotable, and she really is. But the quote is, "The manifestation of the winds of thought is not knowledge; it is the ability to tell right from wrong." The point is that thought is not about truth or knowledge; it's about meaning. Which is the argument she's making in that thinking section of Life of the Mind. And in many ways, the thinkers and actors that she's talking about in this book, Men in Dark Times, are people who shed light on meaning. They're not people who seek a kind of knowledge. That's the one sort of exception, is at least in some ways Hermann Broch, who we discussed last week, where she has some issues with that. But it's that quest for meaning through the wind of thought that is what I think drives Arendt forward. I don't want to get too caught up on the scholarly aspect of Adorno. I actually like the quotes you read, and and I think you're right. Adorno is richer than sort of just a Marxist view, or just a dialectician view, and so that was really helpful. But I don't want to get caught up on that. Are there other questions? I know there's a question about the relationship between flaneur and worldliness in the chat from Rob. Rob, you want to say more about it, or just leave it at that?
I guess just the connection between thinking about it from the private and public realms. A flaneur seems to be someone who isn't in the public realm, and just kind of wanted just maybe explanation or kind of an unfolding of that idea.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you know, what I think is so wonderful about Arendt's presentation of Benjamin here is, you know, as we've talked about, she has so much love for him and deep respect for him, and so in one level, and the presentation of him as a flaneur is very positive. It's this sense of his willingness to stand apart from categories, to not seek truth in concepts, to not be a dialectician, to not seek worldly success, and to be true to his idea, and there's a real respect for the flaneur that one hears in the text. And yet, as I said, she says the whimsy shouldn't take us away from the fact that it's quite dangerous, this idea of the flaneur. And I think the danger, you know, has to do with what you're calling worldliness, to the extent that the flaneur, you know, in a positive way, is not seeking power or usefulness or serving the state, but they're not really engaging people. In fact, you know, they don't, you know, you collect books, but you may not read them. You collect pearls and wisdom and quotes, but who cares if you publish them or not, because you hopefully have an income from your father. You know, publishing is not a priority, let alone acting in the world. And so there's a way in which she's critical of the interiority, the pulling back of the flaneur. Now, it's not absolute, and as she says in On Revolution, these men of letters, these hommes de lettres, in the end, in their pulling back and withdrawing from the world, found, as almost a kind of remedy for the obscurity they felt, found a new idea that they dredged up from the classics, from the Romans, this idea of public happiness, the Romans and the Greeks. And in so doing, had a profound effect on the foundations of new freedom in the modern era with the French and the American revolutions. So, you know, I don't think it's a one-way positive or negative portrayal of the flaneur. She sees it having a complicated history.
Roger, can I ask a question?
Yes, Amori?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to know more about how the political conception or the conception of the public realm in the tradition, and how the idea of Benjamin's conception of it and Arendt's conception of the tradition clashes, because it gave me the impression that she's trying to, through this essay, to rebut or reply to a possible objection of that concept by Walter Benjamin. And that is that, and if Benjamin think that thinking is go beyond any restriction, and beyond that restriction, you acknowledge that this restriction of thinking is false, then you're gonna be able to look at the truth that will appear like it was magic, right? But if Arendt says that we go to the public realm to discuss, but based on one another on a public tradition or some tradition that was built on, then how can we make a balance between these two ideas? Because Benjamin will tell Arendt that that's okay. You can build a tradition, but at the end, that will create some kind of state of nostalgia for those that living in the past will make a decision about what to do or what to be in the future, whether by irrational thinking or by mere decision, as Benjamin some way or another took from Carl Schmitt. Do not know if I made myself clear, Roger.
Yeah, no, I think it's very clear. I mean, you know, I would put it this way provisionally, and we'll see how it goes. On the critical level, I think Benjamin and Arendt are very close, right? And I don't know what they used to talk about while they were playing chess per se in Paris in the 1930s. But one imagines some of this came up. But regardless, they're very close. They both fundamentally believe that the tradition is over. Now, Arendt will write that this sort of moment of the break of tradition sort of became fact in the 1940s with totalitarianism. Although she dates it back to the early 20th century, the turn of the century, from about 1890 to about 1914. So for Benjamin, obviously, it's earlier. I think Benjamin also felt it more in his experience as a Jew, in this sense of this need for both assimilation, for both wanting to be a Jew and yet wanting not to be a Jew. I think his generation, for whatever reason, felt that in a way Arendt didn't so much, until she felt it in different ways because of not Nazism and a much more virulent anti-Semitism in her time. But the general idea they share. The tradition is broken, authority is broken, it's not coming back, and it's nostalgia to want to. It would be nostalgic for either of them to want to bring back not just the coral or the pearl, but the whole reef. To try and bring back the Greek or the Roman world or the medieval world or the Christian world or the Jewish world is folly. And they agree on that. Where I would say there's probably space and room for disagreement is that for in Arendt's view, Benjamin and Kafka are just critics. Critics and then collectors, and they sort of they bring these objects, these pearls, these wisdoms out, and they love the fact that the pearls and the coral makes you think. And thinking, she says, one of our favorite quotes of Arendt, there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. And the reason thinking is dangerous is because when you think, you question all traditions, you question all authorities, and you destroy. Now, Arendt is with Benjamin on that. She is a thinker, and she thinks we no longer have traditions and we have to destroy them, and we have to be willing to destroy them. But she also, and here's where I think she differs from Benjamin, and part of it is Benjamin didn't get to live through the Holocaust and didn't get to live through totalitarianism. She did. She is painfully aware of how dangerous thinking is. Painfully aware of how dangerous thinking is. How dangerous it is to destroy the traditions. How dangerous it is to destroy what she calls the banisters, right? That you hold on to, the Christian traditions and the Jewish traditions that we can poo-poo if we want, the moral traditions, but those things still held people in check. And what she's painfully aware of is getting rid of those is a tragedy in some way. And so she says, a lot of her work is be careful about just destroying. Be careful about engaging in tearing apart, because you don't know what's going to end up. That's the first difference between her and Benjamin. The second is she comes to believe that even though you can't resurrect the past, you can't have nostalgia for the whole world, there is the possibility of the creation of something new. And this is all, all of her ideas of natality, of foundation, of freedom. For her, to be human is to be a beginner, to start things. And she says it's pessimism, and it's unjustified pessimism, to think that just because the tradition is over doesn't mean we can't start a new one. And so her work is always alert to and open to the possibility that some new tradition might emerge, which I don't think someone like Benjamin ever thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I do, Nancy.
Okay. I'm struck by how different her essay on Roncalli is, where there's admiration for his internal, not his lack of conflict, and his ethical acts. And it seems so different from the agony of conflict that both Hermann Brock and in a different way Benjamin have. So I wondered if someone would comment on that, because in that,
Nancy, just explain to me exactly. So you're saying in the Benjamin essay there is conflict, or
I feel as if there's internal agony as well, and there's the presence of bad luck as well, but of the hunchback. In fact, I was going to ask you about the connection between the hunchback and the sort of I guess the agony of the incompatibility of tradition with assimilation, looking at traditional Judaism and being at odds with your impulse to assimilate. I see that as a kind of internal as well as a cultural conflict. And I was wondering, it seems that with Roncalli, for example, she's not very critical of Roncalli. Yeah, I'm sorry. Did I say?
I completely misunderstood you. I didn't. That's what was confusing me. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
She's talking about Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, the Pope John the 13th, another essay in the book.
And I hate to bring that up, but it seems like I've been trying to understand her choice of individuals to talk about in this book because of the Hermann Brock being so odd amidst the other selections. And so I was thinking back about Roncalli and how the simplicity that she admired and that led him to act ethically, unambiguously, seems quite different from her treatment of most of the others.
I think what unites them all there's a couple. It'd be interesting to see other ideas people have, but on the most fundamental level, what unites them all is their independence, their self-thinking. They're people who stand apart from not only the masses, but from other intellectuals. Roncalli was someone whose simplicity separated him from the other members of the church. Brock, in a way, was a literary genius who criticized literature and said it can't reach the truth. Benjamin is an intellectual and a writer who is not an intellectual and not a writer in some ways. They're all people who are self-thinking, who are sui generis in some way, and then B, they're all people who in her reading pierce through a kind of mendacity, a kind of lie that has been told in the world, and in doing so shed light on a darkness that has taken over the world. I'm sure there are probably other similarities one can find if anyone wants to contribute any. But that's
Did you
sort of
say they reject the conventional?
Yes,
All reject
absolutely.
the conventional.
Absolutely.
One question that comes up in the chat box, which relates to this, that they have in common, is Arendt's conception of immortality as well. which strikes me as something that she goes back to in almost all of these essays, and remembrance, and how these writers weren't recognized during their lifetime. So I think a few people wanted to talk about immortality and excellence as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, some of them had more recognition, I guess. I mean, certainly Karl Jaspers had recognition in his lifetime, but they are all people who, in some way, either in their lifetime or afterwards, had enough impact in the world that they became part of our common world, right? I mean, you know, we can debate some of these. I mean, how many of you knew Hermann Broch, right? How many of you knew Pope John the 13th? I mean, the 23rd, Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli. For that matter, I imagine many of you have not heard of Randall, of Waldemar Gurian, or Jarrell, who we're going to read about in a couple of weeks, Randall Jarrell. You know, but to some degree, they're people who are known, and that's important for this question of immortality, because for Arendt, to shed light on the world, you can't just be in a hole, right? You can't just be a flaneur walking around Paris. In some way, you have to shed light on the world, and the way you shed light on the world is not really by shining a flashlight or saying something. It's for whatever you do, it's when people start talking about it. People start telling stories about you and, and your works. And that's what she, in many ways, means by immortality. It's achieving a kind of life after death. And in her mind, one of the great tragedies of modern society is a loss of a desire for immortality, a loss of a sense that to be fully human means to do things, to speak words, do deeds, live in such a way that you are remembered. And that is for her an absolute, and because what that does is it's a way that human beings found new worlds, create new foundations or revolutions. And so in many ways, her attempt to publish Illuminations and save Benjamin from the dustbin of history is an attempt to immortalize him, and in a sense, bring him into a world in which he will have a revolutionary impact, where he can actually found something new. And it's something, in some way, he may not have been able to accomplish himself, although he certainly merited it himself. He needed help of friends, and I think that's an important point as well.
I have a question. Did he even want to be recognized and to have this immortality? Because he was a collector and a private person. So did he even want to do that? I don't think it's like just bad luck. He doesn't seem to be this kind of person, because, you know, he's a flaneur, collector, he's a thinker, but he's not someone who's looking for glory and immortality.
I think it's a complicated question, Zineb, because I mean, he clearly suffered for being overlooked. At least that's my impression. I'm not a Benjamin scholar, so you know, if there are Benjamin scholars here who want to jump in, feel free. You know, I think it's a good question. Arendt has this view that the desire to be recognized and seen is one of the fundamental desires of humanity, and yet she also does recognize that some people have it more than others. But I think I think Benjamin wanted it. I just think he was not willing to do what it took to get it, and he made that decision.
But Roger,
May I?
in Hannah Arendt's
Daphne, yeah.
in Hannah Arendt's writing, would the desire for immortality or recognition always apply to the creative? I mean, there are people who are going to be immortal and recognized forever, like our current president, for the wrong reasons. Does she ever address that kind of recognition and immortality, as opposed to the recognition that's so deserved of the people
she does, Daphne, and it's one of the more controversial lines in her writing. You know, when she says, you know, if someone has access to Google, it's the line about greatness as the one measure of action in the human condition. But it basically, what she says is the one way we measure whether somebody is acts and thus is in some sense human is their greatness. And she says specifically that's not a moral criteria, it's a non-moral criteria. So there will be people who act horrifically and yet will be part of our immortal world. Hitler, you know, is one. The president, you know, whether you think of him as another. You know, yes, there's no doubt that that criteria of immortality is a non-moral criteria.
May I ask a question?
Yes, who's this? Who said that? George, yes. And then I'm going to ask Ken Crimstein to just say a quick word about a drawing of his. But go ahead, George, and then
Just a quick question. I'm new to this. It's about Benjamin, really, the unlucky hunchback aspect of him. I'm a Polish Jew, and an Ostjude, as Hannah Arendt would have called me, not a complimentary term from her. And as I've read a lot of Benjamin, and but as we were speaking about this unlucky hunchback thing, I think that in my tradition, we would have called this a schlemiel.
Yeah.
And that particular aspect of it, and again, in my tradition, in the old days at least, the schlemiel and the holy fool, really, according to Singer, enjoyed the protection of the community. In Germany, where all the Jews wanted to become good Germans, this didn't happen. And perhaps you can comment on that aspect of it.
That's a wonderful question, George. In fact, you know, so I'm sure you may or may not know that Arendt has a whole writings on the schlemiel in her book on Rahel Varnhagen, which we read a couple of years ago in this group. But as I was reading this today, one of the things I kept wondering is, should I mention that Benjamin is a kind of schlemiel for her? And I didn't want to go there.
If I may interrupt, Kafka called himself sort of that too, you know, with Josephine the singer and all that. So there's a continuity there.
I think there's without a doubt a continuity there. And I thought your other point about how in the Jewish shtetl the schlemiel was protected by the community is a fascinating one, because you know, Benjamin was supposed to be, in his mind, protected by his father or his family, and when that didn't happen, in the end he was protected by his friends, right? I mean, in the end, Arendt and Scholem and to a certain extent Adorno looked out for him, and some other people as well. And so there was that, but you're right. There, in a world like today where the traditions are broken, there's not a built-in safety valve for the schlemiel. Ken, are you here? I wanted to give you a chance to say something.
I am, Roger. Thank you. Thanks.
Ken Crimstein's here. I'm going to share on my screen a drawing of Ken's. He's the author of, hold on, let me see if I can do this. A wonderful book, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt. It's a a graphic novel. And in it, there's this drawing I've always loved, and I think it's one of the more famous drawings from the book, of Hannah Arendt laying on her couch, being spoken to by Walter Benjamin. So
Yes.
Ken, I thought maybe you'd say a little bit about your interpretation. It's just one drawing in a like a 15-page or 10-page encounter between Arendt and Benjamin in the book. But maybe I thought it'd be interesting to have Ken talk a little bit about his interpretation of that encounter.
Well, thank you, and what a great group. Yeah, I mean, inspired a bit by my living on West End Avenue for a while, and dealing with water stains on the ceiling of my apartment. So yeah, I did this biography of Hannah Arendt, kind of coming at it from her life, and I discovered, kind of to my delight, that this close connection between her and Walter Benjamin, which went very, very deep. The time spent in Paris, the fact that Benjamin was actually sort of a cousin of her first husband. They may, in fact, maybe we were even at the wedding together, who knows. And the connections between Benjamin's eventual suicide and how she always kept him in her mind. They just kept intersecting. So at a point in the book, Hannah Arendt is going through a mental thinking process, and Benjamin is gone, but she has this notion of dialogue with herself. So I imagine he appears as a water stain on the ceiling. So all the drawings are like that. And she has a dialogue with the specter, if you will, of Walter Benjamin, who's trying to, she's bouncing her thinking off against his thinking. So it was a neat way to bring that kind of active dialogue to life. And I think there was just a huge, I'm fascinated by the connection between them and the inspiration. I certainly knew she got a lot of inspiration from him. I imagine he got inspiration from her. Think of those chess games you were talking about. So I don't know. So that was what I tried to show. And thank you. One thing I was thinking about, just apropos the conversation, and I rereading the third part of it, Benjamin is a collector, and I'm a collector, and it looks like a lot of people are, and I love that whole notion of collecting. And in a way, this book is a collection. This book is a collection. This book is a collection of long quotes, if you will, maybe. So it's interesting, and it is kind of a weird collection. But so anyways, that's it. So thanks, yeah. Huge connection there.
Thanks, Ken. And I don't know, I take it you mean the book, The Men in Dark Times. It's a collection of individuals from the past. That's a fascinating, I had never thought of that before. It's a great insight. So here you have
something really quick, very short.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed Ken's book, which I have.
Thank you.
And also that when she's writing about Walter Benjamin, and I was thinking of it in visual terms, he's like a collage artist. I know people who do incredible work with collage, and that's his expression, but it's a verbal collage, is kind of the sentiment that I got to remember a metaphor by.
That's really interesting because Hannah Arendt talk about the surrealistic aspect of Benjamin's work and thinking, which she likes. And collages are also really, in art, it's like related to the surrealist movement. So I think that's a really interesting thing that you've just said. Like, I can understand that.
Yeah, the notion of sort of bricolage, which the French word for bringing together lots of stuff, which a lot of people have said is, this guy Stephen Johnson wrote a great book about where new ideas come from. And he talks about sort of this bricolage and just rereading the essay and thinking about Benjamin and yeah, he was the original mashup artist. This idea of a book only of quotations. And another thing that, the whole notion of these arcades and just kind of the rubbish of the world being truer than the stuff that's sanctioned. So, you know, I just found, I mean, I knew about Benjamin long before I knew about Arendt. So, you know, it was a delight to find their connection. So, and I think Sam may have referred to a video which I discovered, and I think you can find it on the internet in Vimeo, of her giving a talk in German at the Goethe Society in New York in the 60s about Benjamin. And it's another way of showing what Roger was referring to as that affection. I mean, I just think there was just such a deep affection between them.
Ken, I've seen the talk, and it always has a voiceover in English, not subtitles. Is there a version with subtitles?
That's where I found it. It was all in German, but it just had subtitles. I don't know if they've taken that down or not. That's how I
can't seem
saw
to
it.
find it. Okay.
It's available on, you can rent it as a video through Vimeo. It's owned by some guy who basically rents it out. There were 3 versions of that talk in German. It has not been published in translation in English. They're in the archive.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to pick up on some of this last comments of Ken's and Daphne's and Zined's and others. I think it's a really insightful way of thinking, first of all, about this book as itself a pearl diving into history for these persons in dark times who shed light. And then, you know, this is something I think a lot about my reading of Arendt and about Arendt herself. Arendt is not a systematic thinker in the least. And some people who try to make her such, I think, are making a big mistake. But one of the things I've come to realize over the years of writing about her and reading her and teaching her. So when I teach a book like this, or when I, you know, present it to you, you know, I have to find my way through it. There's not a logical line. And yet what I found over the time is that my way through Arendt's texts is through particular quotes of hers, right? She's an aphoristic writer. In many ways, a lot of what she writes are aphorisms that are sort of connected by other texts. And that I have found as a way of reading Arendt is to find the aphorisms that are at the core of what she's doing in the texts and see how they connect and how the text structures around them. It's just one insight I have about how I think if you, I often come at a text and I try and take it apart and line by line, step by step. And in the end, I can usually make a step-by-step argument somewhere in the text, but it takes putting things from all over and pulling it, and it's usually based on a series of aphorisms that I find in the text that she's written. And I think that's to me an important method of approaching Arendt's text that is worth thinking about.
Roger?
Roger,
yes.
Can I say something very, sorry.
B, yes, is that you? I can't tell.
It's Margaret.
Margaret, I'm sorry, I don't see you on the
Hi,
screen.
Just very quickly, what you were saying about her being an aphoristic writer just takes me back to the whole importance of metaphor, because you're taking something out of its context. You're basically accomplishing, the éclat, as they would say in French. I mean, that the explosion or something milder than that would allow you to go towards something new. So those quotes placed through the text, I agree with what you're saying, do exactly that. They're taken from, whether it's, Kafka or Heidegger or whomever or whatever, but she is attempting to take them to go somewhere new, somewhere without banisters, basically.
So wonderful.
So Roger, I want to make a short comment about context.
Short, because we're out of time, but short.
Very short, right, exactly. So there's a good deal of conversation about flaneur. And my comment is that a flaneur requires an environment. Her description of Paris explains why flaneur comes up in Paris, because that is a city that actually invites the flaneur, as Manhattan once did, no longer, I think. And there are very few places that are like that. So it really is a combination of person and context.
Wonderful. We usually go 90 minutes. We're just a little over that. So thank you. For those who want to stay on, I want to ask one or two questions, if you don't mind. If you have to go, I understand. For next week, we're going to be reading another one of the really great essays in this book on Bertolt Brecht. And it's long, so make sure you give yourself time to read it. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you all. We had over 100 people here today. It's the first time. I don't know if Gal is still on, but thank you, Gal, for writing the piece in the New York Times about our group. I hope Zoom was good. If you guys have comments on how we use Zoom, if you have any questions, let us know. I want to just begin people thinking about what we might read next. We've got 2 more weeks of reading this book, and then we'll be in June. A lot of us are still going to be somewhat isolated, so I think we might continue. There's a bunch of ideas that I've come up with. I'll throw a couple out, but I was wondering what people have in mind. So a couple ideas to throw out. One is Essays and Understanding, one of her main posthumous collections of essays we've never read. 2 would be one of her books of letters, either a book of her letters with Jaspers, or potentially her book of letters with either Sholem or maybe Mary McCarthy. She's a brilliant letter writer, and it would be quite interesting, I think. We've never read one of her books of letters, and it might be nice over the summer to, actually, I thought of that because obviously in this essay on Benjamin, so much of what she's citing comes from Benjamin's and Kafka's letters. And it just struck me as potentially interesting to read, because her letters are brilliant, to read some of her letters. Another idea I had was an interesting collection by Susanna Gottlieb called Reflections on Literature and Culture, which has about 40 short, usually between 2 and 10-page excerpts about Arendt's either reviews of books or artworks or writing about art. And it's a nice little collection that very few people read, and a lot of it in it is stuff that no one reads. So that would be of interest.
Roger,
Yeah.
It's really hard to buy books while this continues, especially if you live on an island remote without any access to a library, and you depend on, say, God forbid, Amazon or something like that, because they're not delivering books, they're not essential. So could you choose a book that's really easy to get rather than one that I will have months? I couldn't even get Men in Dark Times.
Well, I do hope that in the next 2 or 3 weeks that might change a little bit, Daphne, but I don't know. But that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. We could also, I know there were some people who asked if we could read one of the big books again, either Origins of Totalitarianism or The Human Condition. I know we've read The Human Condition about a year ago in this group, so if people don't want to do that again, I understand. Those are some ideas. I'm happy, I assume the people who are still on, well, there's still 74 of you on, so that's great. Happy to hear what people think. We have now the interesting scenario where a lot of you have been with us for 4 to 6 years, and a bunch of you have been with us for about 3 or 4 months, and some of you are just coming on. So I'm open. I'd love to hear what you guys would like to read.
Hi, Roger. This is Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, I would love to read the essays on art that you mentioned. I think that would be really fascinating. Or I'm also totally fine with origins because it may be easier for people, for everyone to obtain.
Thank you.
Okay.
Other thoughts?
Roger, I long ago recommended and would like to repeat that when we read Origins, we gave very short shrift to the anti-Semitism section. We went through it very quickly because we were eager to get to the later parts of the book since they seemed more relevant. But for me, the first section is always relevant. And so I would really welcome a rereading, at least of the anti-Semitism section of Origins.
That's a great idea. And by the way, that reminds me, another idea I had, which is related as a book to read, would be The Jewish Writings, which is a collection put together by Jerry Cohn. It's a great collection. It has a lot of the material that was in Origins in its rough draft, or not rough draft, in its original publication. We could even read parts of the Origins chapters in addition to it. But if people were interested in that, that would be another option, just putting it out there.
I vote for any of the books of her letters because I happen to have them all, so it won't be a book problem.
I happen to think it would be really fun to read her letters. I mean, you know, I don't know how many people want to read letters, but they're quite interesting. I mean, the most obvious one to read would be Jaspers or Sholem or McCarthy. But I'm open to suggestions.
I would love to read the letters.
Yeah, I was just say, after rereading all the letters and many of the unpublished letters in the last year, the Jaspers book is really rich. I mean, letters might sound like correspondence or back and forth conversation, but it's a text in itself. I mean, it really could be studied for a long period of time, and she's in conversation with him when she's writing a lot of her major work. So we could even combine the letters with some sections from Origins or Eichmann as well to see how their conversations play out.
That's not a bad idea.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea.
I'd go.
Is there sort of almost a consensus, God forbid, on the Jaspers letters?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
There's a Jaspers letter to from Hannah Arendt about the Eichmann trial. This speaks about the various ethnicities of the Jews, the German Jews versus the Polish Jews. Interesting.
Cool. This is the book in English. There's a German, obviously, if you'd rather read the German, it's in German too. But it's called Correspondence, and sort of funny that Sam just said it's not really a correspondence, but that's what they call it.
That's not what I meant. I didn't mean it like that. I didn't want people to get the idea. It was like, hey, how was your week? This is a very serious text.
I completely understand what you meant. I had forgotten that it was called Correspondence. So when I just looked at it, I was shocked. Anyway, this is the book. I would order it soon if you're interested in doing so. We will start it probably. We could take a week off, but sometime mid-June, because the next 2 weeks we're finishing Men in Dark Times. So if you're interested in continuing to read with us, order this book now. We have a link on our website for those who can order it from, get a discount from Oblong Books. But you can go through Amazon. Also, what's the other bookstore.org is the one I've been using. So you get it from local bookstores. Is a great site to use if you don't want to use Amazon.
I use problem when you're overseas though, because shipping is halted. So like Canada isn't that far away, but it took me about 8 weeks to get a book that I ordered from Amazon right now. So
Amazon's okay. Amazon's okay.
Yeah, in the US, both Amazon and bookstore.org have been sending me books pretty regularly.
Yeah.
I don't know if Amazon.ca works better, or if it works, I don't know.
Maybe they don't know where Nova Scotia is. That's a problem.
So let's read this. This sounds great. I actually, you know, I mean, I've read in this book for years, but I've never made my way through this big book. So it'll be fun for us, fun for me. I look forward to it. Are there any other, since you guys are on, I mean, you're the stalwarts, are there any other comments or questions?
I just wanted to say thank you for another wonderful session.
I can't hear, but someone said something.
I said, just wanted to thank you for another wonderful session.
Oh, thanks, Jack. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. This was a great group. And, you know, I worried, I've always wanted the group to be a little bigger, but always worried that if it got bigger, who knows what would happen. But today I thought it got bigger, and I mean, we've been over 80 or 90 the last 3 or 4 weeks, and it's worked well. And today we were over 100. So thank you all for reading Arendt with us. It's really a wonderful thing.